I was way too harsh on Banjo-Kazooie. I still remember when I first found out that there was a second Banjo-Kazooie game. We went out and bought it that very weekend. My game originally belonged to someone named Vicky, according to the permanent marker on the front. When I first completed Banjo-Kazooie XBLA a few months ago, I was pretty excited to also be able to play Banjo-Tooie. Unlike the first game, I had never actually beaten it, and I wasn't nearly as familiar with it as its predecessor, so I was genuinely surprised to learn that the online perception of this game was less than positive. Up until that point in my head, I had viewed Banjo-Kazooie as nearly the perfect 3D platformer, and Banjo-Tooie as the game that somehow managed to expand and improve on perfection. So what's up with Banjo-Tooie? Was I completely wrong about it? Is it actually vastly inferior to the first game in almost every way? Yes. Just like the first game, Banjo-Kazooie is a 3D collectathon platformer developed by Rare for the N64 and later given a glorious re-release on the Xbox Live Arcade. From the very second you start playing Banjo-Tooie, you might notice that something feels off. You might not notice it immediately through your excitement or the admittedly awesome opening cinematic, but something just doesn't feel right. The color palette is much more moody and dull, and the music is much more ambient and less upbeat. Some people might like the more ambient music, but personally I think it's a lot weaker than anything heard in the first game. In my opinion, the whole game just feels like it had the life sucked out of it. The cool honeycomb pattern that used to represent your HP has been replaced with a health bar. The two characters that used to change their expression depending on how hurt you were are now just static images. Instead of having talking items that explain what they do like in the first game, now everything is either explained by a signpost or a literal drill instructor. The sense of fairy tale whimsy is gone. Banjo-Kazooie had a level on, "Ooh, spooky ghost, you better watch out, here's some bats, now you're a pumpkin." Banjo-Tooie has a level on the horrors of industrial-era capitalism. Every level feels downright gloomy, in large part thanks to the muted color palette. Banjo-Kazooie had more moody levels like Clanker's Cavern and Bubblegloop Swamp, but they still retain that same kind of magic. I think a lot of this has to do with the soundtrack. Like I said, I feel like the music in the first game is much more upbeat. I would unironically listen to the theme for Clanker's Cavern. Meanwhile, I can't even remember half the songs from Banjo-Tooie, despite the fact that I spent much more time with them thanks to the much larger level sizes. This isn't to say that I think the songs are bad. Banjo-Tooie has some bangers like Cloud Cuckoo Land and Jolly Roger's Lagoon, and I know I'm going to be smitten for daring to criticize anything by Grant Kirkhope, but this just isn't it for me. Alright, so now that I've talked for 2 paragraphs about how my main criticism towards the sequel to one of my favorite games of all time is that its vibes are off, maybe I should get into something with a little bit more substance. What actually changes in Banjo-Tooie? Well, the basic gameplay stays pretty much the same. You keep all of your moves from the first game, but they do this really annoying thing where most of your moves that you already know are rendered completely useless, only so that you can learn something that does the exact same thing. The most egregious example of this is the Bill Drill, which does exactly the same thing as the Beak Buster, except everything in Banjo-Kazooie requires this new move instead. You also learn this first-person egg-aiming move, which is the bane of my existence. The aiming in this game is terrible. They use this awful control scheme where the reticle constantly tries to fight you back to the center of the screen. You control the whole thing with only one stick, which makes sense on the N64 since the N64 only has one stick. But they don't change the controls for the XBLA version for some reason. They fully reworked the controls for the FPS sections, and those are great. They're one of my favorite parts of the whole game, so why not fix the egg aiming too? And it's not like this is something you can mostly ignore. Egg aiming is much more important than in the first game. There are 2 boss fights that require you to hit really precise targets with these eggs while either flying or swimming. These hitboxes are ridiculously unforgiving. And there's so many minigames that require you to use this move too, like tons. And of course, this is the central mechanic of the final boss fight. You can unlock a homing egg cheat to make these sections quite a bit more tolerable. I skipped these cheats for my playthrough since they definitely sounded a bit more like actual cheat codes rather than just upgrades like in the first game. But after I finished the game, I unlocked them and realized that they really do a lot to make these sections more bearable without being OP. So I would definitely recommend unlocking these as soon as possible. So what about the level design? It's bigger, and by bigger, I mean massive. The levels are much, much bigger than in Banjo-Kazooie. That's about it. But bigger isn't always better. Banjo-Kazooie had relatively small worlds, but they were packed with collectibles. They were dense. There were collectibles around every corner. Banjo-Tooie appears to be bigger than its predecessor, but it's all air. There are actually fewer collectibles than in the first game. Despite having the exact same number of worlds, Banjo-Tooie has 10 fewer jiggies than the first game. And for some reason, they decided to group notes into nests of 5 and 20, meaning that even though there are technically still 100 notes per stage, in reality there are only 17 nests randomly scattered around. And they're so easy to find you don't even have to think about them. So 10 fewer jiggies, barely any music notes. They got rid of Mumbo tokens and replaced them with a stage-specific item called Globos, so those have no impact on gameplay at all. And despite all this, Banjo-Tooie is at least twice as long as the first game. I finished every level in Banjo-Kazooie in an admittedly fast around 30 minutes. Every level in Banjo-Tooie took well over an hour, with the later ones taking close to 4. In the first game, jiggies were a reward for some kind of small challenge. Climb a mountain, stomp on this turtle's feet, solve a matching puzzle. Relatively simple stuff that only took a few minutes. When there were long-form missions, like the Croctus feeding objective in Bubble Loop Swamp, you could easily take care of them while completing other jiggies. In stark contrast, in Banjo-Tooie, jiggies are much more scarce because, of course there are fewer jiggies in a larger space. There is no better example of this than this one mission in Pterodactyl Land, where you are asked to help Scrotty with her 3 kids. You are expected to open the train station in Witchy World, break open the first child's cage so she can get on the train, go to Pterodactyl Land, open the train station there, call the train to Pterodactyl Land so she can run back to her cave, follow her to the cave, destroy this boulder, go find and unlock Mumbo in Pterodactyl Land, bring Mumbo to the cave, through the back entrance because he can't climb the main path. Use Mumbo's spells to bring the second child back up to the proper size. Walk Mumbo back to his skull. Bring back Banjo and Kazooie. Split up with Kazooie and use Banjo to pick up the third child. Walk her to the train station. Walk back to the cave and meet up with Kazooie. Take the train to the cliff top, assuming of course you remembered to open the cliff top train station earlier. Unlock Mumbo on the cliff top. Bring him to the train station, heal the third child, walk back to Mumbo's skull and get Banjo and Kazooie, take the train back to Pterodactyl Land, walk back with the third kid to the cave, and then, and only then, can you collect your reward. What is your reward, you might ask? A single jiggy. One single jiggy. Friendly reminder that by the 5th world in Banjo-Kazooie, if you wanted a jiggy, you would have to win a short race. It taking longer to complete missions isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I hope most people will agree that this is way too much work for virtually no payoff. And while Pterodactyl Land is probably the worst example, just about every level has at least one of these massive side quests that usually require backtracking and result in a more than underwhelming reward. I guess it's time to talk about the backtracking. Not one single level in Banjo-Tooie, besides the last one obviously, can be completed on the first visit. Backtracking on its own isn't inherently bad, but this game almost never handles it right. You find a Jiggy, Cheeto page, or any other collectible and spend way too long trying to get to it, only to realize that you need to move from 3 worlds later, and the backtracking tag teams you with the interconnected worlds. Banjo-Tooie is often praised for making the in-game levels feel like one connected world, and I'll admit, from a story and world-building perspective, they do a phenomenal job, but from a gameplay perspective, it only serves to make the already frustrating level design and backtracking even more pronounced. Often to complete an objective, you may have to do something in a completely different world. This is almost never handled right. Usually the entirety of a puzzle or challenge will take place in one world, only for the actual reward to be given to you in a tiny walled-off section in a different world, making it count for the second world's total. This is really annoying because it makes it even harder to keep track of what you've already done and what you still need to do. The only example I can think of them handling this correctly is in the first world, Mayhem Temple. You have to sneak through this tunnel into a cave in Pterodactyl Land to retrieve a statue. You can actually explore the cave a fair bit beyond what you actually need just for the statue, and then you take that statue back to be exchanged for a Jiggy on your way out in Mayhem Temple, meaning it actually counts for that world and not Pterodactyl Land. It's all one big cohesive mission, and it's super cool. I would have loved it if they kept this approach the entire game, but for some reason they abandon it as soon as the second world. In this world, you have to free this rat from a prison compound, but you can only break this rock with a move found in the second world, meaning you have to backtrack to the world you just finished just to break a rock. They could have easily put this rock on the Glitter Gulch Mine side and avoided the pointless backtracking. But at least this Jiggy still counted towards Glitter Gulch Mine. Take this Jinjo and Grunty Industries. It's locked in this glass box, and the only way to get inside seems to be through this tunnel you can see through the window. So where's the entrance? Oh, just hidden in a cave in Jolly Roger's Lagoon, the level 2 stages ago. And this Jinjo isn't even part of that level, it's part of Grunty Industries. Why does this have to be so needlessly confusing? Any one of these issues would have been overlookable on their own. They're much less noticeable in earlier levels that run closer to an hour, but when the levels start going closer to 4.5 hours, it's a lot harder to ignore. Banjo-Tooie was draining. I wanted to enjoy myself so badly, but towards the final several worlds, I found myself just wishing I was done. It's really soul-crushing to spend all day in a level like Grunty Industries only to see that you're barely halfway done. I will admit, I probably didn't play the game in a way that's the most conducive to fun. If you're going to play Banjo-Tooie yourself, which I still suggest you do, especially if you already have Rare Replay, use the cheat codes from the start. Maybe don't go for 100% completion right away, and if you do, maybe don't try to do it all within a single week. I think if you opt to play this game at more leisurely of a pace, a lot of the smaller issues might not be quite as annoying, and the bigger issues might not wear on you as much. Give Banjo-Tooie a try, just don't push it. This is by far the longest one of these videos I've made, and I didn't even get a chance to cover half the stuff I wanted to, like the similarities to Donkey Kong 64 and frickin' Canary Mary. I hope you liked it. I don't plan to start making videos of this length regularly, I just had a lot to talk about. I'd really appreciate it if you would like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Still on the grind for that tinfoil play button, you know how it is. All of my other social media is linked below, and as always, I really appreciate you watching.